Hello, friends. This is Darren Hayes of Pigskin Dispatch.com. Before we take you to your favorite Sports History Network show, just want to tell you a little bit about some merch that you can pick up that represents your favorite SHN podcast. So far, there's t-shirts, coffee mugs, and even books from some of the authors that do podcasts right here on SHN. Who could buy something better than that, than have the history right from the gentleman that you hear talking about it? But we also are adding things each and every day. And where's that store, may you ask? Well, it's at sportshistorynetwork.com. Up at the top, there is the SHN merch button. Click on that. It'll take you right to the store, and you can be representing your favorite podcast and show the world that, hey, on the swag that I'm using, it's the headquarters of sports yesteryear, Sports History Network, and my favorite podcaster, the Sports History Network store. Shop there today. We have a special encore presentation from 2021 and the great podcast we had with Chris Willis celebrating Joe Carr on his birthday of October 23rd. Hope you enjoy this little podcast we had from last year and the best of the Pigskin Dispatch.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history on a day-to-day basis. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time. So as we come out of the tunnel of the Sports History Network, let's take the field and go no huddle through the portal of positive gridiron history with PigskinDispatch.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. When we have the opportunity, we love to celebrate the great people of the game of football. And we have that opportunity today because we are celebrating the birth of one of pro football's pioneers, and that's Joe Carr. And we have an author, our good friend that's been on the program before, Chris Willis of NFL Films, who's actually wrote a couple books about Joe Carr. He has the Columbus Panhandles, which we've talked about when we talked about the team. And he has a book specifically on Joe Carr, the man that built the National Football League. And we'll bring him in right now. Chris Willis, welcome back to the Pigpen.
Thanks for having me, Darren. Glad to be back to talk a little bit about Joe Carr.
Yeah, he is quite the interesting figure. And really, a lot of people nowadays don't really know much about him, but he is such a pivotal person. And just really, you can appreciate that once you read your books on him. And I'm glad that you were able to join us today to share Joe's story and tell us a little bit about it. And of course, people make sure you get a copy of the book and read it. And if you could share that title officially, because I probably butchered it in the intro, Chris, if you could.
No, it's Joe Carr, the man who built the National Football League.
Okay, I paraphrased it close. I apologize. Yeah.
That's all right.
All right. Well, where do we begin with Joe Carr and his football journey?
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about Joe Carr, you have to talk about Columbus, Ohio. That's where he was born, like we said, on October 23rd, 1879. And that's where he sort of fell in love with sports. He was not a very big man, probably wasn't more than 5, he was in the 5'8", 5'9", about 160, 70 pounds. He was kind of a light Irishman at the time, but he just loved sports and doing research on his early life. I've always was fascinated to find that sort of he was, even from a young age, he says, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, he was organizing the games in his Irish neighborhood, with the other kids, he, especially baseball, he's, establishing the rules and picking the teams. So for a kid who, really wasn't, a predominant athlete or, had the physical stature of being, oh, wow, this guy's going to be a really good athlete. He was sort of a born organizer, and that started in Columbus in the neighborhood, and then it developed into he became a sports writer for the Ohio State Journal, turn of the century in 1900, and then through his employment through the Pennsylvania Railroad, we talked a little bit in previous episode on the Columbus Panhandles. He became the team manager, so he didn't play, but he managed the team. He got him to games. He organized games. He did the publicities, team photos. Got to travel, the team together and stuff like that. And so through those sort of avenues, whether it was sports writing, being a team manager, and then being a leading team manager for early pro football, that sort of got him his juice flowing to wanting to be involved in the sport. He was also a baseball executive and a basketball executive, through the 1910s and 1920s, but it was always football was his first love. He wanted I think those other sports were kind of established, especially baseball was already established. They had a lot of leaders, and he always thought football needed more leadership. And that sort of got him started being this sort of born organizer. And it paid off because he was NFL president, for almost 2 decades, for almost 20 years. And all these sort of things that he went through and experienced, whether it was sports writing, through team manager, through, publicity, organizing, the Columbus Panhandles, all sort of, the NFL was a benefactor. There's no doubt about that. When you read the history and the things that the league did in the 20s and 30s, it was because of Joe Carr's leadership.
Chris, in your book, it takes us to an interesting point, sort of the end of the summer of 1920. And we had a couple pivotal meetings that established the APFC, the APFA, the NFL. It's kind of gray there. They change so often in that time period. And then that's a couple of years. But in your book, you talk about that first meeting, August 20th of 1920, where sort of the we'll call them the big four, I guess, of Ohio pro football teams joined. And you said that Carr was not, and the Panhandles were not involved in that. Was there like a specific reason that they weren't? Were they just, shunned for, personal reasons or something?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting sort of backstory to sort of the formation of the National Football League. I mean, one thing of my research that I found was unique. We can even go back. Carr always wanted a league to be formed. There were some rumblings in 1916, 1917, but that was before the war hit. Then those things were put on back burner. And then when they came back from the war in 1919, they were starting to, think about it again. And obviously in 1920, but in my research, I found an article in January 1920 where Carr visited a baseball promoter in Martins Ferry, John Maloney. In the articles that was in a couple Ohio newspapers talked about a pro league being maybe formed that fall. I mean, this is January 1920. This is almost 7 months before the actual meetings to form the NFL. So it was always on Carr's mind to be involved with pro football and be there at the beginning, especially an organized sport, because that's where it needed. Baseball was organized, some of the other sports were organized. Well, football wasn't quite at that level until 1920, and my only sort of opinion with this, that once they got to August, like I said, he was involved in baseball during the spring and summer. So I think that took the backbone. He was be involved as an executive in minor league baseball at the time. So when the sport was starting to form in August, to sort of kick, well, here's going to be the fall season. Do we want to start a league? Like you said, the big four, I think, was Kent, Akron, Dayton, and Cleveland. That were starting to form, this sort of league. Columbus was left out. And my only guess is, at the time, the Canton Bulldogs were the best team in pro football. And they were owned and operated by a guy named Ralph Hay, who owned a Hummelbill and a dealership there in Canton. And he had the best team. He had Jim Thorpe. He had the best player and the best team, heading into 1920. So he was going to be at the forefront. Well, in 1919, the Columbus Panhandles played the Canton Bulldogs, and the Columbus Panhandles were at the end of their run. They had played for 20 years. The Nesser brothers were on that team, the 6 famous Nesser brothers. Well, they were all getting late 30s, even 40 years old. Well, they played, and the Bulldogs destroyed the Panhandles, and I think only like 2,000 people showed up. So it was a really weak gate for Ralph Hay. I don't think he was happy about that. This is my only opinion. Like I said, I'm not sure if this was, but I think there was a little bit of an icy relationship, because after that, they did not play for the next couple of years. Like, no Columbus team, or at least the Panhandles, did not play in 20, 21, 22. They did not play the Canton Bulldogs. So my thought was, maybe Ralph and Joe said, "Oh, he cost me a gate. We could have gotten another team in here, and I could have made more money," because he was just, the Canton Bulldogs were a high profile, high payroll team at that time. So if only 2,000 fans showed up, he probably lost money on that game. He's like, well, and the score was very high. It's probably like 40-7. Like, it was not the Panhandle's most shining moment. So that was my opinion. Like I say, because when 1920 started, the Panhandles became one of the original 14 NFL teams, although they were not there at the two main meetings in August and September. They did play a schedule of all those teams, except for Kent. They played Akron, they played Dayton, so they played all the other teams. So it wasn't like they were left out of the schedule. So that's my only sort of thought, is that maybe because Ralph was setting up these two meetings, that Joe and them might not have seen eye to eye in the way to sort of get it organized.
Yeah, I thought there must be something, because at first I thought, well, maybe it was a geographical thing, because you've got, Akron and Massillon and Canton, they're all Cleveland, they're close together. Then I sit down and think, well, Dayton's invited. That's, the completely other side of the state. Columbus is much closer than Dayton is. And then I said, well, maybe there had to be something. So, okay, I'm glad you explained that. That's interesting. So losing some gate fee from a bad performance by the Panhandles and lack of interest, I guess, from the fans in Canton to come watch them play. So, all right. So he didn't attend the famous September 17th meeting. Also, that was also at the Hutmobile showroom. But so, how did he and the Panhandles get involved in the APFA at that point?
Well, I think it was more the fact that at that time, the old so-called Ohio League was the best teams in pro football. And Columbus was still. They had been around for 20 years, so they weren't totally left out. Like I said, they were kind of sort of at the end of their rung. They weren't quite as good, just because, like I said, the Nesters were getting old, but they were still a team that most teams still wanted to play. Like I said, they played Dayton, they played Akron, they played some of the other better teams. So they just, like I said, Joe Carr just didn't make it to the meeting, but the team was still good enough to be like, hey, we need teams. George House has got the famous quote. Teams were supposed to pay $50 to get into the league. He said most teams didn't pay it, but they were supposed to be this sort of facade of, hey, if we're going to establish the league, we need the best teams. And Columbus, although like I said, they were probably over the hill, still had cachet with the Nesters that they could, be a sort of, a team that you would want to include in the league. So, so at the end of the day, like I said, there was only 10 teams at the September 17th meeting in Canton, but 14 are really considered charter members of what would become the NFL.
Do you think maybe some of it possibly too could also be, I know Al Nesser had left the Panhandles at that point, and I believe he might have been with Canton or Akron for that initial year.
Yeah. Well, Al was the youngest of the six brothers, so he was still a little bit in his prime. He played for Akron in that first season and helped the pros win the first NFL championship with Fritz Pollard in 1920.
And I think weren't a couple of the other brothers still playing for the Panhandles that first season too? And
there was like three of them that were still there in 1920. So yeah.
Okay, so I was thinking maybe that connection too. Just hey guys, you want get a team together. We're having a good thing going here. I'm with Akron now, but hey, we know Columbus can still be a good team and can be competitive in this, or maybe something like that, some family tie. Who knows? Panhandles and Joe Carr are having some. They're in the APFA, eventually the NFL. Now, how does Joe Carr end up getting the highest position in the young league at some point?
I mean, that's a good story, but. Like I mentioned before, Joe was a born organizer, and he was very interested in the future of pro football. He could see it being as big as Major League Baseball. There are several quotes that you found in newspapers where he thought that pro football, even this is in the 1920s, that pro football would be bigger than Major League Baseball, which at the time, like, baseball was the most popular sport, with Babe Ruth in the 1920s and stuff. So after that first year in 1920, the APFA actually had Jim Thorpe as its president. He was the biggest name in football, but he was not an administrator. And they knew that, the first year there was no standings. There was no real rules and regulations that were supposed to be established. That never got done. So, there was no league off. Like, there was nothing that was actually done in 1920, except that they played games, and Akron Pros went unbeaten, and they were, in April of 1921, they were voted the champions, of the league, So, but a lot of the owners were had dissatisfaction to the league. There was nothing being done. Is this really going to happen? Like they were losing money. So in April of 1921 in Akron, they had the league meetings, and Joe Carr, actually was there this time. He actually, he made the trip there. His panhandles were in the league, and he was the one that sort of voiced his opinion that we need to keep with this. We just need better leadership. Pro football is going to have a great future. It's going to be one of the biggest sports in this country. It's going to be just as big as Major League Baseball. So he supposedly gives this big spiel of what the future of pro football is like. And all the owners were on board, and they kind of knew they had the right man for the job of president, So when they had their election, he came up. I think there was a quote that says he was elected when he was out of the room against his will. But I just think that made for a good quote, because he definitely wanted the job, and he wanted to guide pro football. And so since, starting in April 21, that's how he became the president of what would become the NFL, when they changed the league name in 1922.
Well, I mean, what brave foresight that he had to say that it was going to become, as big as baseball and one of the major sports, because it wasn't even the largest form of most popular form of football at that time. It was, the college game was much more popular than the pro game in that era. So, wow, that is really quite a great job of Nostradamusing that one.
Yeah, it was tremendous. And it was in several newspaper quotes. This wasn't just, this was, he even started in the 20s, and then you saw it in the 30s when the NFL, and the NFL, like they said, was still, 6th, 7th on the popularity poll. He would say, he's like, oh, baseball's better days are ahead of them. Like, he didn't put down baseball, like, oh, baseball's not good. He said baseball, and he was, like I said, he was an executive in minor league baseball. He would say baseball's better, or best days are ahead of them, but he just thought pro football and the NFL was going to be just as big, and it's just going to have, and there's going to be stadiums with 80,000 people, and it was just going to be just as big as major. Like, he said that throughout, definitely through the 20s and definitely throughout the 1930s. Finding those quotes are really tremendous to find.
Boy, if he could see it 100 years later, boy, would he'd be right on the mark there, I'm sure. Wow. So what were some of the things after when he got into the office of leading the Young National Football League at this point? What were some of his accomplishments that carried on even in today's game that we could take a look at?
Yeah, I mean, I always say, I think I say that in the introduction, that he's like the Henry Ford of the NFL, and that's why, he's not the only man that built the National Football League. He had some of the other owners, but he did build the foundation. A lot of the things that the NFL exists or sits on today was because of Joe Carr. Whether it's like his very first year, he does the Constitution and bylaws. Well, they didn't have that the first year, so he helps writes the first Constitution bylaws that is still used today. There's still rules in that first Constitution, they're still there. He does the first standard player contract, which was kind of based on baseball with the reserve clause. Now the reserve clause doesn't exist anymore, tying a player to this. But at that time, that was like, so he writes the first player contract, then he sets up territorial rights where once you had a franchise in the NFL, you were protected. Another team couldn't come into your protected area and play a game and take the gate away from you, because the gate was the most important thing at the time. It wasn't TV money. It wasn't, sponsorships and naming rights on your stadium. It was people paying tickets to get to watch the games, then later, in some of the other, he does the NFL draft with the owners. He helps with the other owners splitting the National Football League into two divisions and forming the NFL championship game, which that was done in 1933. Well, the first 12 years, they didn't have a championship. They didn't have like a World Series. It was like whoever finished with the best record would be declared the champion. Well, the owners and Joe Carr say, we need to do a better job of this. We need two divisions, the two division winners, and have this sort of winner take all like the World Series. And, so those are certain things. And then the other thing happened in 1925 when Red Grange turned pro. It's a huge thing. Red Grange was the biggest college player, at football, might have been of all time in Illinois in 1925. Well, he leaves school to go join the Chicago Bears. And the colleges didn't really like that. They hated it. They this is why, you got this negative image because, kids are leaving leaving school. And so they formed a rule that was called the Red Grange rule, where a player had to or their class had to graduate before they could play in the NFL. So if a kid played 1 year and then dropped out of college, he couldn't play for another 3 years in the NFL, so which was a Red Grange rule, which that was challenged roughly 1989 when then college juniors could come out, so that lasted a very long time. So all these things that, and some of the issues, like I always talk to people and some of the issues that face the NFL now, well, they faced them in the 20s and 30s, whether it's player movement and free agency, whether it's stadium issues, like I said, in 1938, he developed a film called Champions of the Gridiron, which was like pre-NFL films 40 years. It really was a publicity film to say, this is what the NFL is about. Here's the players, here's the games, so and he was also the guy who wrote the first NFL record and fact book. It was called the Official NFL Spalding Guide in the 30s, but now that was what's called, so that's lasted almost 80 years. So all these building blocks, that the league sits on, a lot of them were developed and were handled in the 20s and 30s under Joe Carr's presidency.
Now, I think, that's great accomplishments. Where would we be without even half of those things not being done at that time? But I think one of the more interesting things that really showed Joe Carr's moxie and his staunchness to protect the game of football, I think had to come with that, the whole championship, I believe 1927, the Pottsville, Frankfurt, I guess you'd call it almost like scandal, and the Chicago Cardinals thrown in there. I thought that's brilliantly, if you read your book, it's brilliant what Joe Carr did. And maybe you could help explain that out.
It's a unique time period. First you got to say Joe Carr, it was 1925, it was the fall of 1925, which also had the Red Grange turning pro also at the same time. So he's dealing with these two heavy issues. And it was the Pottsville controversy. And so you got to think 21, 22, 24. So this is barely his fifth season as president. This is very early in his career, with the NFL. And the short story of the Pottsville was Pottsville defeated the Chicago Cardinals late in the year. The season had not ended, but they had defeated the Chicago Cardinals, and it looked like they were going to be NFL champions. All they had to do was really finish out the season. So the owner of Pottsville wants to actually have a big payday. I have the NFL champions, so I'm going to go play this game against the Four Horsemen Notre Dame All-Stars, in Philadelphia. Well, there was already a team in Philadelphia called the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets. And like we mentioned earlier, there's territorial rights. You can't just, I'm going to play games. And so Joe Carr, and there's proof, there's newspaper articles, and there's a print of where he told the Pottsville owner, don't play this game. If you play this game, you will be suspended, or something. You're going to break a rule and you can't play. So the Pottsville owner, Dr. Striegel, he ignores that and he plays the game anyway because he wants to make money, or he thinks this is going to be a big payday. And it turned out he did. He broke even on the game, against the Notre Dame All-Stars. Well, as soon as that happened, Joe Carr rendered the decision and said the Pottsville franchise is suspended. You're ineligible for the title. You broke a rule. Here's the consequences. And I just think during his entire nearly 20 years, and almost in any of the NFL presidents or commissioners' decision, I think it's one of the 3 or 4 gutsy, tremendous decisions that's ever made. He suspended a franchise. You're ineligible, and I feel sorry because people think Pottsville got robbed and everything, but it's totally the opposite. The proof is they broke a rule. They were warned not to play. They broke a rule and they were suspended. So they were always ineligible to win the title because they were suspended because of them breaking a rule. If he just doesn't play the game, they finish the season and they're most likely they would have finished ahead of the Cardinals in the standings and they would have been NFL champions. But because they were suspended, they were never eligible for the title. I think what gets a little confusing to some people is, and it's like this, there's a lot more layers to this. The following year, Red Grange and his manager Pyle started a rival league called the American Football League, and they wanted to recruit Pottsville. So Carr allowed them to come back in the league because he didn't want to lose one of their better teams to the rival league. So everybody thinks, oh, they're back in the league, that maybe they were the champions. Well, no, he suspended them at the end of the 25 season, so they were not eligible for the title. So that's kind of the short, condensed version of what is known as the sort of the Pottsville controversy.
Now they could have probably almost, if they hadn't played the game in Philadelphia in Frankfurt's territory, if they would have just had a home game in Pottsville or wherever they were, their home field was, they probably would have been all right doing that. And probably Carr wouldn't have come down on them. That would be
I think they would have been okay. I just think they played it, I believe it was at Shibe Park in Philly. That facility had like 25,000 people, 30,000, but they didn't get nearly that. If they played in Pottsville, they would have only got like 3,000 or 4,000 people, maybe 5,000, but it would have been worth it because he didn't make the money that he thought he was, because not a lot of people came out for the game, in Philadelphia. So, and it, like I said, it ended up costing the team the title.
All right. Well, yeah, that definitely a very brave decision. Probably, not popular in Pottsville 100 years later, but probably wasn't real popular across the country because even the Cardinals really didn't want to take the title at that next meeting that they had in the spring. But they, from what Joe Ziemba was telling us, but finally they said, okay, well, basically we'll take it, because they felt a little bit awkward, I guess, maybe.
Yeah, it was a reluctant acceptance, like the league where it's like, you're the champion, you're either going to accept it or not. So, but they are still, if you look at the record book, the Chicago Cardinals are the 1925 NFL champions.
So, okay, so where do you think, where did Joe Carr, how did he end his tenure as the president of the NFL?
Well, I think, like I said, at the end of his it was a little cut short because he died of a heart attack in May of 1939, and he was only 59 years old, so, he still had some years ahead of him, like I said, he had done, from 1921 to 1939, and the last NFL game he attended was the 1938 NFL championship game. It was the Green Bay Packers played the New York Giants at the Polo Grounds, and I believe the attendance was well over 48,000. So almost nearly 50,000 people showed up at the NFL's premier event, and that's what it was becoming at that time, the NFL championship game in 1938. It's only in its fifth rendition, and so the sport was becoming more popular. I think in 1939, the fall after he passed away, they went over 1 million paid customers, for the first time ever. So at the time, like I said, it's very unfortunate that he passed away, because he would have been able to see some of these things, that the sport did, several years later. Obviously, World War II put a little bit of a slowness to it. But you see what happened in the 1950s, the sport took off with TV, whether he makes it there, but he would have been able to see some of these sort of events and things that would have happened in the 40s and maybe even into the 50s, if he lives long enough, So near the end of his reign, like I said, the NFL was probably at its most popular point at the time. Like I said, the NFL championship game was a premier sporting event. It was sold out, nearly 50,000 people. It was you had these great stars, Don Hudson, Sammy Baugh, Sid Luckman came in 1939. Like, you were getting these top flight athletes, like I said, I talked about championship. Gridiron was a film, like a publicity film, like he was thinking along those lines, more publicity and promotion. They had the first televised game. Now TV was really in its infancy in 38, 39, with the Eagles Brooklyn Dodger game that they televised. But this was the path that the sport was going on, especially once it got through the 40s and into the 50s. Like, this is what was going to happen. And he was setting it up for that, like it was going to be this big city sport, played by these great athletes, and it's going to be a very popular sport.
Now Chris, your research on Joe Carr, I mean, probably him probably about as good as anybody that's still on this earth today, just from your research, because it's impeccable and your books are excellent. But what do you think if we could talk to Joe Carr today and we look back at what he did, what would he believe his greatest accomplishment was for pro football?
And that's a great question. And I think you see it, like I said, he passed away in 1939. And I still think you see his greatest accomplishment today, and that's why when I say he built sort of the building block and he's the Henry Ford of the NFL, it's because of his recruitment of financially capable owners to run big city franchises. At the time when he became the president in 1921, the NFL was in all the small towns, which is fine because that's where the lifeblood was. It was the Cantons, the Akrons, Daytons, Columbus. You had Rochester, you had Decatur, you had Rock Island and Hammond. You had all these small towns that were where the NFL or where the pro football started, and that's where the lifeblood was. Well, by the mid-20s and into the late 20s, Joe Carr saw like, hey, if the NFL was going to be a big city sport like Major League Baseball, we have to be in the big cities. And in order to be in the big cities, you needed financially capable owners to run them. And he started in 1925. He already had George Halas in Chicago, but Halas told him, go do what you need to do. And he did. In 1925, he went to New York and he recruited Tim Mara. Well, we know that the Mara family still owns the New York Giants, almost 100 years later. In 1932, he recruited George Preston Marshall to invest in an NFL franchise in Boston. And that franchise moved to Washington. Then in 1933, he recruits Burt Bell for a franchise in Philadelphia, the Eagles. Same year, he recruits Art Rooney for a franchise in Pittsburgh. In 1934, he recruits George Richards to take over the Portsmouth franchise to be in Detroit. And then Cleveland in 1937. Well, there's your NFL. That's your legacy. These teams have been the building block of the NFL for years, with only Green Bay as sort of the last of the small town teams. And that's his legacy. Now the NFL, this was in the 20s and 30s. Well, ever since he did that, the NFL was always a big city sport. Maybe it wasn't the TV money in Park Avenue at the Super Bowl with Rozelle. Well, the building blocks in the 20s and 30s is why those things happened much later. Why the sport took off in the 50s, why it was great on TV, why the merger or the AFL formed, why the merger happened and the Super Bowl was formed, and then you had expansion and you got bigger TV deals and now you got streaming, the drafts, 3 days. The draft started under Joe Carr, with help, Burt Bell and the owner saying we need a draft. Well, now because of that, it's a 3-day event and everybody loves it and the ratings are great. The players love it. The kids come in, so I think his legacy is he saw that it could be a big city sport, and these owners, these financially capable owners, needed to be there to help run it. He was the guy from the league office, kind of like now with Roger Goodell, but the owners also had to be there to be able to run these teams. And like I said, this is 80 plus years, and the league is still runs that way.
Yeah, what a tremendous marketing machine it's really become. And you can even sell the Indianapolis Underwear Olympics, the combine, and get good ratings with that also. That's just tremendous. People love their football, that's for sure. So, well, Chris, I appreciate you coming on and talking about this important figure in pro football history, Joe Carr. Now, maybe you could tell us, the listeners, where the best places they can get copies of your books. Because not only do you have pro football books on Joe Carr and the Columbus Panhandles, you have Dutch Clark, Red Grange, and am I missing any?
There's one on Old Leather, which is like an oral history too. So
okay. Yeah. Where's the best place people can get copies of your books?
Yeah, I mean, my publisher is Rowan in Littlefield. So if you go ROWMAN, Rowan.com, you can check the publisher's website. You can also get them on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. So if you got Amazon Prime or Barnes & Nobles, you can go on those websites and check out the books too. Okay.
Now, you have anything coming down the pipeline that we can look forward to, or anything that's coming out soon, or even, articles? I know you do a lot on the Pro Football Journal. We were talking with John Turney just about a month ago. We had him on, and he very complimentary of your work, and rightfully so. It was right about the time you had the, I think the Red Grange candy bar article in there, which was excellent too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always trying to keep one project ahead and stuff. Now on the book front, my next project is a book on Bronco Nagurski, which I actually just finished and turned in this month in October.
Oh, so congratulations.
So that'll be out next fall, like next football season. So if you want to learn a little bit more about Bronco and the Bears and his career, that'll be next season. And now Pro Football Journal, I'm trying to keep up on, and I think the last thing I wrote was about, and that was another Nesser article about Ted and Charlie Nesser. It was the 100th anniversary of the first father-son. See, it's like, Ted Nesser played until he was almost 40 years old. Well, he played with his son during the 1921 season, and they're the only father-son duo to ever play in the NFL. So, so that article went up. I think that was the last week of September is when they had the anniversary date of that. So 100 years ago, this past like September 23rd, 24th.
Wow. Well, we sure appreciate you and appreciate all you're doing to preserve football history. We love your work. Love your research. It's very thorough and factual. And we appreciate you coming on here and sharing with us here at the Pigskin Dispatch. So thank you very much, Chris.
Oh, no, I appreciate Darren, especially on Joe Carr's birthday. So happy birthday, Joe Carr.
Peeking up at the clock, the time's running down. We're going to go into victory formation, take a knee, and let this baby run out. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you back tomorrow for the next podcast. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hi, everybody. Dan and Andrew from Hello Old Sports here. We wanted to drop in and let you know about our latest episode.
That's right. We interviewed the co-authors of Phyllis George, Shattering the Ceiling, a biography of groundbreaking broadcaster Phyllis George. And her life is really sort of a journey through 20th century America, from Miss America pageants to the Kentucky State House to the groundbreaking NFL Today show on CBS, even the Kentucky Colonels of the old ABA. We got into all sorts of stories about the Celtics under Red Auerbach, about the interview with Roger Staubach, about really all sorts of things, a fight between Brent Musburger and Jimmy the Greek. We really enjoyed talking with Lenny Shulman and Paul Volpone, who teamed up to write this book.
The book is on sale right now, wherever books are sold. Within reason. Garage sales, probably not. So go ahead and pick up a copy today. And if you want a chance to win the book, you can go to sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways and register for a chance to win. Goodbye, old sports.